The Third Battle of Ypres had been grinding forward for 3 months and 23 days when Captain Marcus Henley of the 2nd Battalion, King's Royal Rifle Corps, filed his final field report. By that point, in the autumn of 1917, the Ypres salient had consumed approximately 400,000 British and Commonwealth casualties. The ridge at Passchendaele, a low swell of farmland barely 60 meters above the surrounding plain, had become the singular obsession of Field Marshal Douglas Haig's High Command. What had begun in July as a strategic offensive to break through German lines and capture the Belgian ports had devolved into something else entirely. A meat grinder operating in conditions that reduced men to geological features indistinguishable from the mud that swallowed them. The weather that autumn was historically abysmal. October 1917 recorded rainfall totals nearly double the 30-year average for West Flanders. The Flanders clay, a dense, impermeable substrate, could not absorb the deluge. British artillery bombardments, numbering over 4 million shells, fired in the preparatory phases alone, had destroyed the region's centuries-old drainage systems. The Steenbeek, a minor tributary that once meandered peacefully through pasture land, had become a drowned wasteland of craters, each one a potential grave. Men drowned in shell holes. Mules disappeared entirely, sucked beneath the surface with their loads still strapped to their backs. The wounded, unable to crawl free, suffocated in liquid earth. Survivors would later describe the landscape as oceanic, a brown, churning sea that swallowed light and sound and men with equal indifference. The 2nd Battalion had been rotated into the line on the 26th of October, relieving what remained of the 16th Highland Light Infantry near a map reference simply designated as Declined Copse, though no trees had existed there since August. Their objective was modest by the standards of the offensive: advance approximately 800 yards, secure a series of German pillboxes along the ridgeline, and hold until relieved. Standard war of attrition doctrine. 4 companies, roughly 600 men at start strength, equipped with Lee Enfield rifles, Lewis guns, Mills bombs, and the standard entrenching tools that had become as essential as weapons in this war beneath the surface. But there was something else carried forward with the battalion, something that had nothing to do with ordnance or official orders. The Flemish locals, those few who remained in the shattered villages behind the British lines, had begun speaking in the weeks prior about De Rode Neville, the Red Mist. Old women in Zonnebeke and Langemark, their homes reduced to foundation stones and cellar holes, told the same story to anyone who would listen. When the ground was disturbed too greatly, when too much blood soaked into the old earth, the fields themselves would remember. They spoke of medieval battles fought on the same ground, of Spanish tercios and Burgundian knights whose bones had composted into the Flanders soil centuries before the first shell fell. They spoke of a mist that rose not from the ground, but through it, a red haze that moved against the wind and brought with it a cold that had nothing to do with temperature. The British soldiers, exhausted and fatalistic, dismissed the stories as peasant superstition. Shell shock and trauma made men see things. The constant bombardment, the isolation, the rats and lice and chlorine gas, all of it could produce hallucinations. The army had even issued warnings about the psychological effects of prolonged exposure to combat conditions. The phrase, "seeing red," had taken on a grimly literal meaning in the trenches, where men occasionally snapped and charged enemy positions alone, driven mad by fear or grief or something that could no longer be named. But Captain Henley had noted something in his diary 3 days before the attack, an entry that would later be excerpted and then classified by the War Office Historical Section. He had observed a peculiar phenomenon during the night of the 26th of October. A section of no man's land, approximately 200 yards forward of the British jumping-off trenches, had appeared to steam despite temperatures hovering just above freezing. The mist, he described it as rust-colored in the light of star shells, seemed to cling to the ground rather than disperse, pooling in the craters like something heavier than air. His men had commented on it. One lance corporal, a shepherd from the Yorkshire Dales before the war, said it reminded him of the fog that came off the moors before a storm, except that it smelled wrong, like old iron, like blood left to dry on a blade. The battalion would go over the top in 48 hours. The barrage was already scheduled, the objectives marked on the maps. Everything was ready. Everything was in place. And on the ridge above them, something old and patient was waking up. The assembly trenches were less trenches than navigable ravines carved through liquefied earth. The 2nd Battalion had spent the previous night moving forward in single file along duckboard tracks that floated on the mud like narrow piers, each man maintaining contact with the pack of the soldier ahead through touch alone. No lights were permitted. The German lines were close enough that a cough could draw machine gun fire, and the enemy had grown expert at listening for the telltale sounds of a battalion moving into position. Captain Henley had positioned himself with B Company, 2nd Wave, approximately 40 yards behind the forward assault line. His runner, Private Thomas Beckett, a clerk from London, 20 years old, who still flinched at the sound of the heavy guns, stayed within arm's reach. The bombardment was scheduled to commence at 0540 hours. For 2 hours and 14 minutes, British and Canadian artillery would pound the German positions with high explosive and shrapnel, a creeping barrage designed to advance 100 yards every 3 minutes. The infantry would follow as closely as they dared, moving through the curtain of their own shells, crossing no man's land, while the enemy remained suppressed in their dugouts and pillboxes. It was a tactic that had been refined to brutal efficiency over 3 years of industrial slaughter. The timing had to be precise. Too far behind the barrage, and the Germans would emerge from cover and man their machine guns. Too close, and the British shells would fall among their own men. The margin for error was measured in seconds and yards. Henley had memorized the map during the battalion briefing the previous afternoon. The jump-off line ran along what had once been the Ypres Roulet railway embankment, now a shattered ridge of mud and rubble indistinguishable from the surrounding terrain. First objective, a German strongpoint identified as Graf House, grid reference 28.J.15.C.75.45. Though no house remained, only a reinforced concrete machine gun nest built into the foundation. Second objective, a trench system designated Burke's Trench, running roughly northeast along the lower slope of the ridge. Final objective, the ridgeline itself, a vague elevation marked on the trench maps as Point 52, where intelligence reported the Germans had constructed a network of interconnected pillboxes with interlocking fields of fire. 4 companies would attack on a front of approximately 400 yards. Anticipated casualties, 30 to 40%. Acceptable losses by the standards of autumn 1917. But the briefing had contained an addendum delivered without emphasis by Major Aldridge, the battalion's second in command. Patrols over the previous 72 hours had reported unusual conditions in no man's land. 2 reconnaissance parties had failed to return. A third had come back with only 3 of its original 8 men, and those 3 had been unable or unwilling to provide coherent after-action reports. One corporal, a veteran of the Somme, had to be sedated. He kept repeating that the craters were breathing, that the mud had hands. Division headquarters attributed the incidents to German patrols and the general psychological strain of prolonged operations. Standing orders remained unchanged. The men knew better than to speak of it openly, but the rumors moved through the assembly trenches like a contagion. Sergeant William Croft, a Londoner who had survived Loos and the Somme, told his section that he'd heard the Germans had been gassing the low ground, experimenting with a new agent that clung to the earth and produced hallucinations. Private Beckett, crouched beside Captain Henley in the pre-dawn darkness, whispered that his mate in C Company swore he'd seen something moving through the wire 2 nights prior, something that moved wrong, too low to the ground and too fluid, like oil spreading across water. Henley had not reprimanded him. Fear, he had learned, was not cowardice. It was the rational response of the human nervous system to conditions designed to destroy it. The men who claimed to feel nothing were either liars or already dead inside. At 0520 hours, 20 minutes before the barrage, Henley conducted a final inspection of his platoon. The men were spectral figures in the darkness, faces blackened with burnt cork, equipment reduced to essentials: ammunition, grenades, entrenching tools, water bottles, field dressings. They had discarded their packs. This was not a march, but a charge, and every ounce mattered. Some men had written letters and left them in their greatcoats. Some had tucked photographs inside their tunics, over their hearts, as though paper could stop shrapnel. One private had chalked a message on his helmet: "If found, return to 22 Aldgate Street, London." Dark humor as a coping mechanism. Henley noted it all without comment. The mist was still there. Even in the darkness he could sense it, a thickness to the air that had nothing to do with humidity, a faint metallic taste at the back of his throat. The temperature had dropped. His breath should have been visible, but the vapor seemed to vanish the moment it left his mouth, absorbed into something waiting just beyond the range of vision. He checked his wristwatch. The radium dial glowed faintly. 0532 hours. 8 minutes. He looked east toward the German lines, invisible in the darkness, and saw nothing. No star shells, no movement. Only that persistent, rust-colored haze hanging in the low ground, like a second terrain, older and more patient than the one mapped by the generals. Private Beckett leaned close and whispered, "Sir, do you smell it?" Henley did. Old iron, wet stone. Something beneath that, sour and organic, like a butcher's shop left closed for weeks. "Stay close when we go over," Henley said. "Don't lose sight of the man in front of you." At 0540 hours, the world ended and began again. The British guns spoke as one, a sound beyond sound, a physical force that compressed the air and shook the earth. The barrage had commenced, and in the low ground ahead, the red mist began to move. The creeping barrage moved across no man's land like the wrath of an industrial god. High explosive shells detonated in sequential rows, each blast sending columns of mud and shrapnel into the pre-dawn sky. The sound was no longer individual explosions, but a continuous roar that obliterated thought, that reduced human consciousness to pure sensation. Men did not speak during a barrage. They could not. They pressed themselves against the forward walls of the trench and waited for the moment when the whistles would blow and they would climb the ladders into that manufactured hell. Captain Henley watched the second hand on his wristwatch tick through its circuit. The barrage would advance 100 yards every 3 minutes. At 0600 hours, the first wave would go over. B Company would follow 90 seconds later, passing through A Company and continuing the advance toward the second objective. Standard doctrine. He had done this before, at Arras, at Messines, and survived. Survival was statistical, a matter of probability and luck and keeping the men moving forward quickly enough that they didn't have time to think about what they were moving toward. But something was wrong with the barrage. He noticed it at 0552 hours, 8 minutes before the assault. The shells falling in the sector directly ahead, the low ground between the British lines and Graf House, were not behaving correctly. The detonations seemed muted, as though the earth were absorbing the energy rather than reflecting it. Worse, the geysers of mud and debris that should have fountained upward were collapsing back into the craters almost immediately, pulled down by something that had nothing to do with gravity. And the mist, the rust-colored haze he had observed the previous nights, was not dispersing under the bombardment. It was thickening. Private Beckett tugged at his sleeve, pointing. Even through the chaos of the barrage, Henley could see what had alarmed the young runner. In the brief illumination of a shell burst, approximately 100 yards forward, a section of no man's land appeared to be moving. Not the convulsive heaving of earth under bombardment, but a slow, deliberate undulation, like the surface of water disturbed by something large passing beneath. The mist swirled in patterns that followed no wind, forming shapes that almost resembled limbs, faces, grasping hands, and then dissolving before the eye could confirm what it had seen. Sergeant Croft appeared at Henley's shoulder, his face grim. "Sir, the lads are seeing it. They're asking questions." "What are they seeing, Sergeant?" Croft hesitated. He was a man who had survived 3 years of war by trusting what his eyes told him and ignoring what his imagination supplied. "Movement in the mist, sir. Things that don't match the terrain." Corporal Davies swears he saw a man walking through the wire, but the man had no legs below the knee. He gestured helplessly. Just missed where his legs should be. "Shell shock," Henley said, though he didn't believe it. "The barrage plays tricks on the eyes." "Yes, sir." Croft didn't believe it either. At 05:58 hours, 2 minutes before 0 hour, something happened that would later be excised from the official casualty reports. A star shell, fired by the Germans from their lines on the ridge, burst approximately 300 feet above no man's land. For 10 seconds, the entire battlefield was illuminated in harsh magnesium white light, and in that light, every man in the assembly trenches saw the same thing. The craters were full of figures, dozens of them, hundreds. They stood in the mud and water motionless, their forms indistinct but undeniably human in shape. They wore no uniforms that could be identified. Some appeared to be armored in a style centuries obsolete, breastplates and helms that belonged to an age of pikes and arquebus. Others were dressed in the rotted remnants of older British uniforms, tunics from the early months of 1914, before the war had settled into its current form. And some wore gray, German field gray, but torn and fouled with mud, as though they had been lying in the earth for months or years. None of them moved. They simply stood, facing the British lines, waiting. The star shell died. Darkness reclaimed the battlefield, and when the next shell burst, seconds later, the figures were gone. Only the mist remained, thicker now, churning slowly through the craters like something alive and hungry. Private Beckett was shaking. "Sir, what was—" "Steel yourself, Private." Henley's voice was steady, though his hands were not. "We go over in 90 seconds. Behind them, in the communication trench, an officer's whistle shrilled. The first wave was climbing out, a company disappearing into the barrage and the mist beyond. Henley could hear the NCOS shouting, the rattle of equipment, the scrape of boots on the trench ladders. He drew his Webley revolver and checked the cylinder. 6 rounds. He had 2 spare speed loaders in his pocket. 18 bullets total, against an enemy that might not bleed. Sergeant Croft was counting down. 60 seconds, lads. Fix bayonets." The metallic rasp of steel on steel echoed along the trench. Henley watched his men's faces. They knew something was wrong. The veterans knew it in their bones, the way animals know when a storm is coming. The younger soldiers knew it because the veterans were afraid, and that fear was more contagious than any rumor. 30 seconds. Henley climbed onto the fire step, gripping the top rung of the ladder. Ahead, the barrage continued to pound the German positions, but the sound seemed distant now, muffled by the thickness of the air. The mist had risen to the level of the trench, spilling over the parapet like a slow tide. It smelled of rust and rot and something older. Ancient earth, an old bone, and the metallic tang of blood that had soaked so deeply into the ground that it had become part of the geology. 10 seconds. He looked at Private Beckett. The boy was crying silently, tears cutting tracks through the mud on his face. But he was on the ladder. He would go over when the whistle blew. They all would. That was what they had been trained to do. The whistle blew. Captain Marcus Henley climbed into the mist. The first 50 yards were textbook. B Company moved in extended line, maintaining intervals of roughly 5 paces between each man, advancing at a steady walk behind the curtain of the creeping barrage. The ground was worse than Henley had anticipated, not solid earth, but a porridge of mud and water that pulled at every step, threatening to claim boots and men alike. Ahead, the explosions continued their methodical procession toward the German lines. Each shell burst briefly illuminating the mist in shades of orange and red before plunging the world back into that peculiar, rust-colored twilight. Visibility was perhaps 10 yards. Henley could see Private Beckett on his right, Sergeant Croft on his left, and the vague shapes of the men beyond them. The rest of B Company existed only as sound, the splash of movement through water, the rasp of labored breathing, the occasional muffled curse as someone stumbled into a shell hole. Of A Company, the first wave that had gone over 90 seconds ahead, there was no sign. They should have been visible as silhouettes against the barrage, but the mist had swallowed them completely. At 70 yards from the British trenches, Henley encountered the first body, a soldier from A Company, face down in a crater, his back torn open by shrapnel. Fresh blood still steaming in the cold air. A normal casualty, the kind the war produced by the thousands every day. Henley stepped over him and continued forward. 10 paces later, he found another. Then another. Too many, too quickly. The barrage should have suppressed the German response. A company should have been well ahead by now, closing on Graf House. Instead, they appeared to have been stopped cold in no man's land. "Sir?" Sergeant Croft materialized out of the mist, his face pale. "We've lost contact with the sections on the right flank. Can't see more than 3 men in any direction." "Maintain bearing," Henley ordered. "Keep the barrage on our left. If we drift, we'll walk into our own shells." But the barrage sounded wrong now. The explosions that should have been ahead and to the left seemed to be coming from all directions at once, the sound distorted by the mist until it was impossible to determine distance or direction. The compass strapped to Henley's wrist showed east-northeast, the correct bearing toward the objective, but the needle was oscillating slightly, trembling as though caught between competing magnetic fields. At 100 yards, B Company encountered the wire, or rather, what remained of it. The German defensive wire should have been thick bands of barbed steel, chest-high and yards deep, but the bombardment had reduced it to scattered coils and broken stakes. Henley led his men through a gap, his uniform catching on the barbs, and emerged into what the maps designated as the outer defensive zone. The ground here was even worse, a moonscape of overlapping craters, some still filled with water the color of rust, others choked with debris and the remnants of earlier assaults. And in every crater, the mist pooled like liquid, thick and slow-moving. That was when they heard the screaming. It came from ahead and to the left, where A Company should have been advancing toward Graf House. Not the sharp cry of a man hit by shrapnel, but something sustained and rising, a sound that went on too long for human lungs to produce. Then it cut off abruptly, and in the silence that followed, Henley heard something else. A wet, dragging sound, movement through mud, multiple sources coming closer. "Form on me," Henley commanded, his voice low but carrying. The men of B Company coalesced out of the mist, forming a rough defensive perimeter. Perhaps 40 soldiers, maybe 50, less than half the company's strength. The rest were lost in the mist, scattered or dead, or simply swallowed by the terrain. Sergeant Croft was there, his rifle raised. Private Beckett pressed close to Henley's shoulder, his Lee Enfield trembling in his hands. The shapes came out of the mist like swimmers emerging from deep water. At first, Henley thought they were survivors of a company, men disoriented and falling back. Then he saw them more clearly in the brief flash of a shell burst, and his mind refused to process what his eyes reported. They were soldiers, but wrong. Their uniforms were British, 1914 patterned tunics, the old-style puttees and caps, but rotted to rags, hanging from frames that moved with a terrible fluidity. Their skin, where it was visible, had the gray-white color of drowned flesh, and some were missing pieces, an arm ending at the elbow, a face half gone, ribs visible through tattered cloth. But they moved with purpose, advancing in a loose skirmish line, their movements synchronized in a way that no group of individual men could achieve. And their eyes, those that still had eyes, were black from lid to lid, reflecting no light. "Christ," Sergeant Croft whispered. "Christ Almighty." "Steady," Henley heard himself say, though his voice sounded distant and unreal. "Pick your targets." The first volley crashed out, 20 rifles firing almost as one. The figures jerked under the impacts, stumbling, but not falling. Henley saw one take 3 rounds through the chest, the bullets punching through with clearly visible exit wounds, but the figure simply steadied itself and continued forward. Another lost the top of its skull to a well-placed shot from Croft's rifle, and it walked on, blind but unerring, its hands outstretched. "Bayonets!" Henley drew his Webley and fired at the nearest figure, aiming for the center mass. The revolver bucked in his hand. The figure took the round through what should have been its heart and closed the distance at a run. The lines met. What followed was not combat, but butchery. Private Beckett thrust his bayonet into a figure's throat, and the blade went through and out the back without resistance, as though stabbing water. The figure grabbed him by the tunic and pulled him close, and Henley saw its mouth open, too wide, the jaw dislocating, before he put 2 rounds through its temple at point-blank range. The figure released Beckett and collapsed, dissolving into mist and mud and something that looked like old blood. More of them were emerging from the craters now, dozens of them, clawing their way up from the flooded holes as though the water itself were giving birth to them. Henley saw soldiers in German gray, in French horizon blue, in the red trousers of the old French line infantry from 1914. He saw figures in armor that predated gunpowder, their breastplates corroded but still reflecting the shell bursts. All of them moving with that same terrible coordination, all of them converging on B Company's position. "Fall back!" Henley shouted, "Fighting withdrawal to the assembly trenches." The company broke. Discipline shattered under the weight of something that training had never prepared them for. Men ran, splashing through the mud, dropping rifles and equipment in their desperate scramble to reach the British lines. Henley grabbed Private Beckett and dragged him along, firing his remaining rounds behind them to cover the retreat. Sergeant Croft was still fighting, smashing the butt of his rifle into a figure's face again and again until the stock splintered and the figure pulled him down into a crater filled with rust-red water. Henley ran. The mist closed around him thick as wool, and the screaming behind him went on until it seemed to come from the earth itself. He lost track of direction, stumbling through craters, falling twice, each time certain that hands would close around his ankles and drag him down. Private Beckett was beside him, then ahead, then gone, swallowed by the mist or the mud or something worse. He broke clear of the mist at 0614 hours, 12 minutes after going over the top, and collapsed into the forward trench. 3 men from B Company had made it back. 3, out of an initial strength of 110. They lay gasping in the mud, unable to speak, their eyes wide and uncomprehending. Behind them, the mist churned and waited, and from somewhere within it, something that might have been laughter echoed across no man's land. The mist did not stop at the British lines. It spilled into the forward trenches like water seeking its level, pouring over the sandbag parapets in slow cascades that defied physics. Captain Henley, still gasping from his retreat across no man's land, watched it come with the numb detachment of a man whose capacity for shock had been exceeded. Around him, the survivors of B Company were attempting to reload their rifles with hands that shook too badly to work the bolts. One private was weeping uncontrollably. Another had pressed himself into the corner of a fire bay and was praying in Latin, words from a childhood catechism that offered no protection against what was coming. Major Aldridge appeared, moving along the trench from the direction of battalion headquarters, his face flushed with anger that had not yet processed into fear. "Henley! What the devil happened out there? We've had no contact from a company, and your men come streaming back without—" "They're dead, sir." Henley's voice was flat. "All of them. A company, most of B Company. The Germans didn't kill them." "Then what?" The major's question died as the first of the figures climbed over the parapet. It had been a British soldier once, weeks or months or years ago. The remnants of a service tunic still clung to its torso, and the webbing across its chest bore the faded insignia of the Lancashire Fusiliers. But its face was gone, replaced by a smooth expanse of gray-white flesh that nonetheless moved with purpose, turning toward the sound of voices, as though it could see through skin that had no eyes. Aldridge drew his service revolver and fired. The round struck the figure in the chest, punching through with a wet sound. The figure took another step forward, and the major fired again and again until the hammer clicked on an empty chamber. The figure reached for him with hands that ended in fingers worn down to bone, and Sergeant Matthews, a company sergeant major from C Company, who had been moving forward to investigate the commotion, swung his entrenching tool in a flat arc that took the figure's head off at the neck. The body collapsed. The head rolled into the duckboards, and from the stump of the neck, red mist poured out like blood, spreading across the floor of the trench with a hissing sound, as though it were alive and feeding. "Back!" Henley grabbed Aldridge and hauled him away. "Everyone back to the support trenches. Now!" But there was nowhere to go. The mist was advancing from no man's land and rising from the flooded sections of trench behind them, pouring up from the sumps and shell holes that honeycombed the British defensive system. The forward trenches had become a killing ground, and the things that had been soldiers were climbing down into them from both directions, converging on the living men trapped in the narrow corridors of mud and sandbag. C Company attempted a stand at a junction point designated on the trench maps as Clapham Corner. 30 men formed a firing line across the traverse, their rifles pointed at the mist that churned toward them from both flanks. They fired in controlled volleys, the way they had been trained, putting rounds into the advancing figures with mechanical precision. Some of the figures fell. Most did not. And when they reached the British position, the disciplined volley fire dissolved into hand-to-hand savagery that left no room for courage or cowardice. Only the desperate animal struggled to survive. Henley saw Private Collins, a boy from Birmingham who had joined the battalion 2 weeks prior, pulled down by 3 figures that tore at him with fingers and teeth, dragging him into the mist that now filled the bottom of the trench like floodwater. He saw Corporal Walsh fire his rifle until the barrel was hot enough to scorch his hands, then use it as a club until the stock broke, then draw his bayonet and fight with that until something that had once been a German soldier grabbed him by the throat and lifted him off his feet as though he weighed nothing at all. The living fell back through the communication trenches, a fighting retreat that became a rout that became a desperate scramble through a maze that had been designed to slow an enemy advance, but now served only to trap the defenders. Henley lost track of time and distance. He fired his Webley until it was empty, reloaded, fired again. Men fell around him, some to the figures that pursued them through the mist, others to exhaustion or terror, or the simple mechanical failure of bodies pushed beyond their limits. At 0643 hours, 22 minutes into the collapse, Henley reached the support trenches, approximately 400 yards behind the forward line. Perhaps 200 men had made it back, survivors from all four companies, mixed together in a mob that had lost all unit cohesion. Major Aldridge was there, his uniform torn and fouled with mud, trying to restore order by force of will, and shouted commands. Battalion headquarters had been abandoned. The commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Pierce, was nowhere to be seen. Later, his body would be found in a dugout, his service revolver in his hand, and a single bullet hole through his temple, whether by his own hand or another's was never determined. "We have to hold here," Aldridge was shouting. "This is the main defensive line. We hold or the entire sector collapses. Do you understand? We hold!" But there was nothing to hold with. The men were exhausted, their ammunition depleted, their rifles fouled with mud, and the mist was still advancing, slower now but relentless, flowing through the abandoned forward trenches and spilling toward the support line like a tide that could not be stopped. Henley found himself standing next to a Lewis gun position, the weapon manned by a lance corporal whose name he didn't know. The man had perhaps 2 drums of ammunition left, 94 rounds total. He was traversing the gun back and forth across the approaches, firing short bursts at shapes that appeared and disappeared in the mist. Brass casings clinked onto the duckboards. The barrel was already beginning to smoke. "Sir," the lance corporal's voice was hoarse. "What are they?" Henley had no answer. The rational part of his mind, the part trained in military tactics and operational planning, insisted that there had to be an explanation. Gas, perhaps. Some new chemical agent that produced mass hallucinations. Or shell shock, transmitted like a contagion through men pushed too far beyond their breaking point. But the rational part of his mind was a small and weakening voice, drowned out by what he had seen and touched and smelled in the forward trenches. "They're the dead," he said finally. "The old dead. All of them. Every man who ever died in these fields." The lance corporal nodded as though this made perfect sense. Perhaps it did. Perhaps after 3 years and 400,000 casualties, the earth itself had become saturated with death, so soaked in blood and suffering that it had achieved a kind of terrible sentience. Perhaps the dead had been there all along, waiting in the mud, and the constant bombardment had finally disturbed something that should have been left to sleep. At 0701 hours, as the autumn sun began to rise over the ridge at Passchendaele, the mist reached the support trenches. It poured over the parapet like a living thing, and the figures came with it. Soldiers from a dozen armies and a dozen wars, their faces blank or rotted or missing entirely, moving with that synchronized purpose that was worse than any battlefield coordination the living could achieve. The Lewis gun opened fire. Henley drew his empty revolver and realized he had no more ammunition. He picked up a rifle from a dead man at his feet. The bolt was jammed with mud, but the bayonet was still fixed. Around him, the 200 survivors of the 2nd Battalion, King's Royal Rifle Corps, prepared to make their last stand. And then, without warning, the mist stopped. The figures stopped. They stood motionless in the trenches, their eyeless faces turned toward the east, where the sun was breaking through the clouds for the first time in 3 days. For 10 seconds, 15, they simply stood there, as though listening to something the living could not hear. Then as one, they turned and began to move back toward the forward trenches, back toward no man's land, back toward the craters and the wire and the mud. The lance corporal kept his finger on the trigger of the Lewis gun, traversing after them, but he did not fire. No one fired. The exhausted survivors watched in silence as the dead withdrew, flowing back into the mist that was already beginning to thin in the morning light. Within 5 minutes, they were gone. The mist dispersed, evaporating as though it had never been, leaving behind only the familiar desolation of the Western Front, mud and wire, and craters filled with rust-red water. Captain Marcus Henley leaned against the trench wall and slid down until he was sitting in the mud. His hands were shaking. He was alive. Against all probability and reason, he was alive. And all around him, men were beginning to realize the same thing, their faces slack with exhaustion and disbelief and something that might have been gratitude or might have been simple incomprehension. Major Aldridge was the first to speak. What just happened? No one answered. There was no answer to give. By mid-morning, the 2nd Battalion had been relieved and marched to rest billets in the ruined village of La Martiniere, approximately 8 miles behind the lines. Of the 600 men who had gone into the line on the 26th of October, 173 answered roll call. The official casualty report, filed by Major Aldridge in his capacity as acting commanding officer, listed 427 killed, missing, or wounded. The report made no mention of the manner of their deaths. It did not need to. Casualties of that magnitude were unremarkable in the autumn of 1917. Captain Henley spent the afternoon in a battalion aid post, being examined by a medical officer who looked at his pupils with a penlight and asked him routine questions about headaches and ringing in the ears and difficulty sleeping. The MO, a captain from the Royal Army Medical Corps who had seen too many broken men to be shocked by another, noted in Henley's file that the patient exhibited signs of acute combat exhaustion, but was otherwise physically sound. Recommended: 48 hours. Rest, hot food, and reassignment to light duties pending full recovery. Standard treatment for what the Army had begun calling shell shock, though that term had not yet entered official medical nomenclature. Henley did not tell the medical officer what he had seen in the forward trenches. There seemed at little point. Either the MO had heard similar accounts from other survivors, in which case he would assume mass hysteria brought on by combat stress, or he had not, in which case he would assume Henley was suffering from hallucinations. The outcome would be the same: a notation in the medical file, possibly a recommendation for psychiatric evaluation, and eventual return to duty or discharge on medical grounds. Neither option would change what had happened. The survivors were scattered throughout La Martiniere, billeted in cellars and ruined houses, too exhausted to do more than sleep and eat the hot stew the field kitchens provided. Most did not speak about what they had experienced. A few tried, testing their memories against those of their comrades, comparing notes in the tentative way of men who needed to confirm that they were not insane. Private Beckett, who had survived, though Henley had been certain he had seen the boy pulled into the mist, sat in a corner of a collapsed barn and stared at nothing. When Henley approached him, the private looked up with eyes that held no recognition. "We walked into hell, didn't we, sir?" Beckett's voice was flat, affectless. "And hell sent us back." Henley had no response to that. In the evening, a staff car arrived from division headquarters carrying 2 officers Henley did not recognize. One was a major from the intelligence corps, the other a captain whose uniform bore no regimental insignia. They conducted interviews with selected personnel: Henley, Major Aldridge, Sergeant Matthews, and 4 enlisted men chosen apparently at random. The interviews were brief and formulaic. What did you see? What did you hear? Did you observe any evidence of enemy gas attacks? Were there any unusual meteorological conditions? The officers took notes but offered no information in return. When Henley asked directly what they were investigating, the Intelligence Corps major simply thanked him for his cooperation and moved on to the next interview. That night, Henley attempted to write his official after-action report. He sat in a requisitioned room in what had once been a village schoolhouse, a candle providing the only light, and stared at the blank page for nearly an hour. How did one describe what had happened? How did one reduce the events of the morning to the sanitized language of military documentation? Enemy contact at 0602 hours. Heavy casualties sustained. Forced to withdraw to secondary defensive positions. Mission objectives not achieved. All of it technically accurate. All of it meaningless. He wrote 3 drafts. The first was honest, a detailed account of the figures in the mist, the impossible nature of their wounds, the way they had moved with synchronized purpose. He burned it in the candle flame. The second was clinical, stripped of emotion and interpretation, reporting only observable facts without attempting to explain them. He burned that one as well. The third was deliberately vague, attributing the casualties to intense German resistance and poor visibility due to meteorological conditions. He dated it, signed it, and set it aside to be forwarded through proper channels. It was a lie, but it was a lie that would be believed because the alternative was unthinkable. At 23:40 hours, unable to sleep, Henley walked through the ruined village to clear his head. The night was cold and clear, the first clear night in weeks. Stars were visible overhead, and in the distance, the horizon flickered with the light of artillery barrages continuing in other sectors. The war had not stopped. Men were dying at this moment, in trenches and dugouts across hundreds of miles of front, and tomorrow more would die, and the day after that. The machinery of industrial warfare ground forward, indifferent to the small horror that had occurred in one sector on one morning. He found Major Aldridge standing at the edge of the village, looking east toward the lines. The major did not acknowledge Henley's approach, but after a moment, he spoke. "I've been thinking about the Flemish woman. The one in Zonabika who told us about the Red Mist." Aldridge's voice was thoughtful, distant. "She said the earth remembers. That's what she said. When too much blood soaks into the ground, the earth remembers." "Superstition," Henley said, though he no longer believed it. "Is it?" Aldridge turned to face him. "We've killed 400,000 men in this salient, Henley. 400,000, and that's just our side. The Germans have lost as many, maybe more. Add the French casualties from the earlier offensives, and you're approaching 1 million dead men in an area smaller than some English counties. 1 million bodies, most of them unburied or barely buried, decomposing into the soil. 1 million men's worth of blood soaking into the Flanders clay." He paused. "What does that do to a place? What does that much death do to the earth itself?" Henley had no answer. Or rather, he had an answer but lacked the words to express it. They had broken something fundamental. The war had been going on for so long, had consumed so many lives, that it had torn through the thin membrane that separated the living world from whatever lay beneath. The dead had always been there, buried in the earth, waiting. And the constant bombardment, the endless killing, had finally disturbed them. "Division is shutting down the investigation," Aldridge said abruptly. "The Intelligence Corps officers left 2 hours ago. There will be no official inquiry. Our casualty reports will be filed and forgotten, just another bad day in a bad year. The offensive continues. We're scheduled to return to the line in 72 hours. They're covering it up." "Of course they are. What else can they do?" Aldridge's laugh was bitter. "Can you imagine trying to explain this to the War Cabinet? To the newspapers back home? Dear citizens, we regret to inform you that in addition to machine guns and poison gas, our soldiers are now being killed by the reanimated corpses of previous casualties. They'd shut down the entire offensive. possibly the entire war. No one would go over the top ever again if they thought the dead were waiting for them in no man's land. They stood in silence for a long moment, two exhausted officers contemplating a truth that could never be officially acknowledged. Finally, Henley asked the question that had been troubling him since morning. Why did they stop? Why did they withdraw? I don't know. Aldridge shook his head slowly. Maybe the sun. Maybe they can only exist in darkness and mist, or maybe they achieved what they wanted. We pulled back, didn't we? We abandoned the forward trenches. Maybe that's all they required. We left the ground to them. And when we go back in 72 hours? Aldridge had no answer to that. In the distance, a star shell burst over the Passchendaele Ridge, briefly illuminating the battlefield in harsh white light. From this distance, it looked almost peaceful. Just empty fields and a low ridge, unremarkable terrain that men were dying to capture or defend. Nothing to suggest that something old and terrible waited there in the craters and the wire. Get some sleep, Henley, Aldridge said finally. That's an order. Whatever happened this morning, we're still soldiers. We still have our duty. Henley saluted and walked back toward his billet. But he did not sleep. None of them slept well that night, or for many nights after. And when the battalion returned to the line 3 days later, they went forward with the knowledge that the enemy they faced was not only the Germans in their concrete pillboxes, but something far older that had been sleeping in the Flanders earth since before any of them were born. The official records showed that the 2nd Battalion, King's Royal Rifle Corps, participated in the final phase of the Third Battle of Ypres and sustained moderate casualties. The village of Passchendaele was captured by Canadian forces on the 6th of November 1917. The offensive was terminated shortly thereafter due to deteriorating weather conditions and the need to redirect forces to other sectors. None of the official histories mention the events of 29th October. The dead keep their secrets, and so do the living who survived them. "16 months after the armistice, a clerk in the historical section of the War Office discovered a discrepancy while cross-referencing casualty figures from the Ypres salient. The 2nd Battalion, King's Royal Rifle Corps, had reported 427 casualties on 29th of October 1917, but the daily intelligence summaries for that date showed minimal enemy activity in their sector. No significant German counterattacks, no recorded gas attacks. Weather conditions poor, but not exceptional by the standards of autumn 1917. The mathematics did not reconcile. A battalion did not simply lose 70% of its strength in a morning without corresponding enemy action. The clerk, a former lieutenant who had served in a different sector and knew better than to ask uncomfortable questions, prepared a memorandum requesting clarification. The memorandum was forwarded to a Colonel Ashford, who had been assigned to review certain irregular incidents from the war for potential security implications. Colonel Ashford read the memorandum, retrieved the relevant files, and spent 3 days reviewing after-action reports, casualty lists, and personal diaries that had been submitted for historical record. On the 4th day, he called the clerk into his office and explained that the discrepancy had been resolved. There had been an administrative error in the original filing, and the corrected figures showed casualties consistent with routine operations. The clerk accepted this explanation because he was tired and wanted to go home, and because arguing with colonels was an inefficient way to maintain employment. Colonel Ashford then placed all materials related to the 2nd Battalion's actions on 29th October 1917 into a file marked with a security classification that would not be downgraded for 50 years. He included Captain Henley's personal diary, which Henley's widow had donated to the Imperial War Museum in 1922 following her husband's death from influenza, and expurgated the entries describing the Red Mist and the figures in no man's land. He included Major Aldridge's confidential report to division headquarters, which had been filed separately from the official after-action report and contained considerably more detail. He included witness statements from 7 enlisted men who had been interviewed by the Intelligence Corps in November 1917 and subsequently transferred to different units in different theaters. All of it went into the file, and the file went into a locked cabinet in a windowless room where it would remain undisturbed for the next half-century. This was not the only such file. Colonel Ashford had discovered, over the course of his review, that the war had produced numerous incidents that defied rational explanation. A company of French infantry that had disappeared entirely during the Second Battle of the Marne, with no bodies recovered and no evidence of German capture. A German observation post on the Somme, where the entire crew had been found dead with no wounds and expressions of absolute terror fixed on their faces. A British tunneling company that had broken through into a chamber deep beneath Vimy Ridge and refused to go back down, claiming they had heard singing in a language none of them recognized. Each incident had been investigated, documented, and then quietly suppressed, not because the army doubted the accounts, but because acknowledging them would require acknowledging something far more disturbing: that the industrial machinery of modern warfare had torn holes in the fabric of reality itself. The Flemish had known. The old women in Zonnebeke and Langemarck had tried to warn the British soldiers, but soldiers did not listen to old women who spoke of ancient things. De Rode Neville was not a new phenomenon. It appeared in local records dating back centuries, parish registers from the 1580s describing a red fog that rose from the battlefield after the Duke of Parma's forces had besieged Ypres, bringing with it the spirits of Spanish soldiers who had died in the assault. Earlier still, in fragmentary chronicles from the 15th century, references to a crimson mist that appeared after the Battle of Gavere in 1453, where Burgundian forces had slaughtered Flemish rebels and left their bodies unburied in the fields. The pattern was consistent. Major battles, heavy casualties, bodies left to decompose in saturated ground. These were the conditions that produced the phenomenon. The earth, soaked with blood and suffering, achieved a kind of terrible memory. The dead did not rest. They remained, suspended in the soil, waiting for the right combination of disturbance and darkness to pull them back towards something resembling life. The constant artillery bombardments of the Great War had provided that disturbance on a scale unprecedented in human history. 4 years of shelling, millions of rounds fired into earth already saturated with the dead of previous wars, had awakened something that had been dormant for centuries. Colonel Ashford understood this, though he had no scientific framework to explain it and would never commit his understanding to paper. He understood that the war had fundamentally altered certain places, had transformed them into thresholds where the boundary between the living and the dead had worn dangerously thin. Passchendaele was one such place. There were others: the Somme, Verdun, the limestone caverns beneath Vimy Ridge, all of them soaked in blood, all of them scarred by bombardment, all of them dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with unexploded ordnance or residual gas contamination. The official policy, never stated but clearly understood, was to leave these places alone. The battlefields would be cleared of weapons and ordnance, the trenches filled in, the wire removed. But certain areas, certain craters, certain sections of former front line would be designated as protected zones, off limits to agriculture or development, maintained as cemeteries or memorial grounds where the dead could be left undisturbed. The stated reason was respect for the fallen. The actual reason was considerably more pragmatic. Captain Marcus Henley never learned that his diary had been expurgated and classified. He had survived the war, returned to England, and attempted to resume his life as a solicitor in Winchester. The influenza that killed him in 1922 was perhaps a mercy. He had not slept well since October 1917. His wife reported that he often woke screaming, speaking of red mist and hands reaching up from the mud. She attributed this to shell shock, and in a sense, she was correct. His shell had been shock of a fundamental kind, the shock of discovering that the universe was stranger and more terrible than any rational mind could comfortably accommodate. Major Aldridge survived until 1943, dying of heart failure at age 56. He never spoke publicly about Passchendaele. In his personal papers, found after his death, was a single notation written in 1938, shortly after the Munich crisis, when another European war seemed imminent. God help us if we ever have to fight in Flanders again. Some ground should never be disturbed twice. Private Thomas Becket lived until 1967, dying at age 70 in a council flat in Southwark. He had spent the interwar years working in various manual jobs, never marrying, never speaking about his service, except to say that he had been at Passchendaele. In his final weeks, suffering from lung cancer, he told his nurse that he sometimes saw them, the men from the mist, standing at the foot of his bed, waiting. The nurse assumed he was hallucinating due to medication. Perhaps he was. Or perhaps the men who had walked through the red mist carried something back with them, a connection to that liminal space between life and death that could never be fully severed. The Passchendaele battlefield today is peaceful farmland, dotted with Commonwealth War Graves Commission cemeteries, where the dead lie in ordered rows beneath white headstones. Tourists visit the preserved trenches and the museums in Ypres, learning about the battles that consumed hundreds of thousands of lives in the pursuit of a ridge that offered no strategic value. The official histories describe the fighting in terms of tactics and logistics, of command decisions and technological limitations. They do not mention the Red Mist. They cannot. Some truths are too dangerous to acknowledge. But the Flemish remember. The old families, those whose lineage in the region stretches back centuries, still speak of De Rode Neville in the quiet of their homes. They know better than to disturb certain fields when plowing. They know that some years, when the autumn rains are heavy and the mist settles into the low ground at dawn, you can see shapes moving through it. Shapes that walk like men, but move with a terrible synchronicity, their forms indistinct, but undeniably present. And they know that when you see such things, you do not investigate. You turn away. You go inside. You wait for the sun to rise and burn the mist away, and you pray that it will. The dead are patient. They have been buried in the Flanders earth for 1,000 years, layer upon layer of them. Soldiers from forgotten wars composting into the clay. They are not gone. They are waiting. And if the ground is ever disturbed again on the scale, it was disturbed between 1914 and 1918. If the earth is ever again soaked with blood and explosives and the accumulated suffering of industrial warfare, they will rise. They will walk. And the red mist will come with them. Silence. The sound of a file being closed. Footsteps receding down an empty hallway. The file marked 2nd Battalion, King's Royal Rifle Corps, Passchendaele Sector, 29th of October 1917, remains classified. It sits in a climate-controlled archive beneath Whitehall, one folder among thousands documenting the things that happened during the war that could never be officially acknowledged. Every 50 years, the classification is reviewed and renewed. The official reason is national security. The actual reason is much simpler. Some stories once told cannot be untold, and some truths, once known, cannot be forgotten. Captain Marcus Henley's final diary entry, written on the night of the 29th of October 1917 and later removed from the published version, consisted of a single sentence. "We did not win today. We were simply allowed to leave." He was right. The battle for Passchendaele continued for another week, and the ridge was eventually captured. But the ground itself, the mud and blood-soaked earth that had given birth to the Red Mist, was never truly taken. It remains contested territory, held by an army that predates flags and nations, an army that sleeps beneath the soil and dreams of the day when it will be called to rise again. That day has not yet come, but the earth remembers, and the dead are patient.